Okay, how's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so in this episode, I thought I'd try to say something about Voltaire and his famous novel Candide. I think that Voltaire gives us a lot to think about in that story. Some really important stuff, actually. And just quickly, if you don't know, the story is about an innocent young man, Candide, and his tutor, Dr. Pangloss, and their travels and their misfortunes in a mad and evil world. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. Okay, so I think that what Voltaire is essentially doing in the novel Candide is he's satirizing the sort of happy, optimistic, theological rationalism of one of the main characters there, Dr. Pangloss. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, so what Dr. Pangloss passionately believes is that this world of ours is not only created and designed by God, but it's the best of all possible worlds that he could have created. And so that whatever happens, however terrible it might seem, is actually really for the best. Okay, but now here's the thing. I think that the main target of Voltaire's satire here is actually the real life philosopher Leibniz, whose view is the one that Pangloss is made to express. So really the bottom line is that Voltaire disagreed with Leibniz's, let's call it, optimistic theodicy or religious view of the world. That's to say, he disagreed with his view that our existing world is the best world that God could have possibly created. Okay, but back to the novel. Okay, so Pangloss's philosophical position in the novel is basically something like this. What he's saying is that the world doesn't have to be a terrible place, even if it happens to be really, really bad for one particular person. So the idea here would be that what is bad for one person is actually, in the big picture, good for the general arrangement of things. So one could be living a life of tragedy, but really what one doesn't see is that there's a reason for that. That ultimately everything is for the best. As the English poet Alexander Pope said in his essay, The Essay on Man, he said, "All discord is harmony not understood. All partial evil is universal good." Actually, no, Candide quotes Dr. Pangloss about just this sort of idea. And it takes the form of an artistic analogy. He says this, he says, "The ills of the world are but the shadows in a beautiful painting." And I think that actually Voltaire himself is basically getting this from the great optimist Leibniz I mentioned, who claimed that, quote, "shadows bring out the colors." Okay, now, what are we to make of this analogy? This analogy with shadows? I mean, in a way, at least when it comes to a work of art, this makes some kind of sense, right? I mean, in a painting, the light and the dark certainly seem to need each other. I mean, they play off one another to form an overall beautiful image. But ultimately, the problem with this is that at the level of real life, it's not shadows we're talking about, is it? No, it's the red of blood-soaked marks. In other words, life just isn't an artwork, despite the many comparisons that we might want to draw between them. The contrast between light and shadow and life and death are two very different ones. I mean, one stays in the gallery, and the other finds its home in the grave. Anyway, so all this said, I think what really bothered Voltaire about Pangloss's optimism or theory that everything's for the best, despite all the personal atrocities, was not that it was completely unreasonable, maybe, but that it cultivated a callousness or a heartlessness in people. That's to say, holding to this sort of view, it made people less sympathetic, more indifferent to the tragedies of others. I mean, for those of us who point out the ways in which the world is not the best that it could be, at least in doing so, we seem to be acknowledging the plight and the suffering of others, right? But not so, it seems, for those who can't imagine anything being better than it already is. Okay, so that was one criticism Voltaire seems to have had. Now, another one seems to have been that this sort of all is for the best attitude made people more apathetic and less active. It made them more resistant to changes and to want to improve things. And, that's not surprising. I mean, when you believe that certain tragedies are not only unavoidable, but necessary, then you're obviously less likely to believe that you can or should do something to prevent them, right? I mean, why strive to improve the world if it's already completely perfect the way it is? Now, this is what was fundamentally wrong with Leibniz's view. In the words of one commentator, it was a cold philosophical system that tried to demonstrate why human suffering is necessary, and because of this, not something that we need to get too upset over. In other words, indifference and complacency becomes the consequence of necessity. That's to say, they become the consequence of a view that says things just had to be the way they are. Okay, well, so now I want to try to say something about what has become actually a very famous line from Candide, one that's found at the end of the story. So, at the end of the novel, what happens is that Candide and Pangloss find themselves in Turkey after having traveled around the world and, of course, suffered immensely because of that. And they come across an old man who's sitting peacefully under a tree by his house. Now, what the old man tells them is that he has no interest in getting involved with the affairs of the world. Instead, all he wants to do is to cultivate his little garden. Well, Candide takes this to heart. He turns to Pangloss and says, "We too must cultivate our garden." Okay, so what does this ending mean? What does Voltaire mean when he tells us that we have to cultivate our garden? Well, obviously there are countless interpretations out there. And so, hey, it can't hurt to add another one to the list, right? Okay, so to be honest, the first thing that comes to my mind when I read that line is that Voltaire is in part drawing an allusion to Epicurus's garden. So who was that? Well, Epicurus's garden, established around 300 BC or so, was a philosophical school and a society of friends whose absolute sole pursuit was the achievement of tranquility or peace of mind. That's to say, the Epicureans weren't interested in trying to answer the big questions about nature and the meaning of the cosmos. No, the only questions that they pursued were the ones that were relevant to the attainment of personal tranquility. In other words, for them, the only point of doing philosophy was to promote this one exact end. And if something didn't promote it, then there was really no point in studying it. So basically, you could say that philosophy for the Epicureans had a strictly utilitarian purpose. Okay, anyway, so what does this have to do with this line in Candide, that we must cultivate our garden? Well, first of all, I think that what Voltaire is expressing and counseling here is a kind of Epicurean retirement from the troubles of the larger world. I mean, apparently Voltaire was a great admirer of the country, places free from the hustle and bustle and the dangers of city life. So, to keep a distance between ourselves and the world of public opinion and ambition, well, that can be very helpful. But it's not just this, of course. More interestingly, I think that what he's also expressing, not unlike Epicurus, is the abandonment of trying to solve life's mysteries by metaphysical or philosophical speculation. It's the suggestion not to seek answers to questions that can have none, especially answers to those questions having to do with natural evil and suffering. You see, I think that what Voltaire is reacting to are grand philosophical systems. Remember, Pangloss, we're told in the novel, is a teacher of metaphysico-theologico-cosmolunology. Anyway, so more specifically, what Voltaire is reacting to is the philosopher Leibniz's philosophical system, one that claims that the reason for evil can be known and that it can be justified or made sense of. A system, in other words, that makes suffering explicable. But for Voltaire, not only can natural evil not be known or made sense of, but to think that it can, to rationalize tragedy, to engage in theodicy, is vain and deeply morally suspect, as I discussed earlier. No, the bottom line for Voltaire seems to be that this sort of grand philosophical speculation is an attempt to solve the insoluble. And so really, the best response is to just stay silent and instead focus on what we can know and on what we can have some control over. Okay, so I think that something like this is what Voltaire is partly expressing in that line, that we must cultivate our garden. Okay, but I said just now that he means for us to focus on what we can know and on what we can have some control over. Now, this is important, and it leads me to what I think is the second part of Voltaire's meaning with that line. Yes, he's getting us to give up on a grand philosophical speculation, but in its place, what he's asking us to do is to get to work and to try to solve life's actual practical problems, especially as they concern those in our little local corners of the world. I mean, there's a time to just be quiet and to admit humility. And there's a time to take action and to do what we can to make a positive difference. And, I mean, think about it. To cultivate a little garden is to do just this. It's to carefully tend to the soil and to make better the environment. It's to make something beautiful come into existence that wasn't there beforehand. Okay, now I mentioned natural evil before. Now that's the kind of evil that's not of our own doing. You know, like the occurrences of earthquakes or tsunamis. And by the way, I mention earthquakes for a good reason. And that's because what partly inspired Voltaire to write Candide in the first place was the actual occurrence of a massive earthquake that struck Lisbon in 1755, where over 30,000 people were killed. It was a complete slaughter. And to make matters even more questionable, it happened in a Catholic city on the day of a holy festival. Anyway, as I said earlier, Voltaire, unlike Leibniz, doesn't think that this sort of evil, natural evil, can be rationalized or made sense of by being made to seem necessary. In other words, all is not for the best for Voltaire. You don't explain or justify suffering by postulating a larger plan or history. It's just perverse to think so. No, as one commentator puts it, for Voltaire, the best response to natural evil is to simply bow our heads and mourn for its victims, to hope for better things to come, and to ultimately acknowledge the incapacity of reason to make sense of such tragedies. Ultimately, to see maimed bodies and the cries of children is enough by itself to prove philosophy conceited and empty. Okay, anyway, so that is natural evil. Okay, but here's the thing. I don't think that the same goes for moral or social evil. And moral or social evil, by the way, refers to the willful acts of human beings. So here, I think Voltaire takes the view that such evil, unlike natural evil, is both knowable and controllable. In other words, it's something that we can do something about. So, and here's the point. When Voltaire tells us that we must cultivate our garden, he's ultimately telling us to stop all of our boisterous theorizing and instead to do what we can, to work incrementally to alleviate moral evil. He's telling us to stop our utopianizing and to make actual real life improvements. He's telling us to stop our rationalizing and just get to work. And as one commentator puts it, he's telling us to remove ourselves from the centers of corruption and to work concretely at our appointed task towards the lessening of injustices. So, at the end of the day, it's a pretty simple message, I think. Through practical action, through the gradual weeding and the pruning and the cultivation of the garden, few as those acres may be, we can slowly begin to grow the fruits of a better world. Bye for now.